A watercolor iris feels heavy and difficult, right? There's so many parts, overlaps, ruffles. Like, how in the world did Georgia do it? Every single time I sit down to paint an iris, the fear of its intricacies seep into my brain, but then I stop and remember. She's just shapes like all other flowers. And today I'm going to walk you through this regal bloom using 3 easy steps. We're going to start with the map. It's basically me using the flat wash brush with light colors, and I'm mapping out the shapes of the flower lightly and quickly. Next, we're moving on to what I call the color. I'm using the 1/4 inch dagger here, lots of wet on wet. You're basically using a variety of versions of the main color, so lots of purples, lots of yellows, lots of pinks in this case, and also really indulging in the wet on damp technique. And last but not least, after everything's dry, the detail phase, where I use my liner brush. All is dry at this point, and so I'm using toned down or darker versions of the first layer colors to add a ton of gorgeous linear detail. So you guessed it, this iris, this intricate, gorgeous, complicated flower can be something you paint successfully in not too much time at all. I promise. Okay, maybe I lied. Maybe there are 4 steps, because this is what we're going to call the pre-game to the map. And I'm on my iPad. I'm using my Apple Pencil, and I'm literally mapping out the big basic shapes of this iris. So the big circle at the bottom, the little circle on top of it, 2 little ears and 2 little flaps. And that is basically your iris, friends. And to help further understand the way this flower is put together, let's look at how the linear detail actually determines the shape of each section of the iris that we just broke down. Look at that. And think ahead to when we're working on the detail later. These are going to be some of the same types of directional marks you're going to create with your liner brush. Okay, now we've got our wash brush in hand, or any bigger brush that you have, and just get a light purple on your brush. It could even be a little bit of dirty water, I kid you not. And using the edge of your brush with light pressure, just map out those bigger shapes that we just sketched out on the iPad. Change up your color as you go, but you're staying really light at this point. Because we're not using a pencil that we can erase, we want to stay light with the watercolor tones at this point so that you feel like if you have to reposition a stroke, you're not going to be set in stone with dark, intense colors. I'm even mapping out some of the greenery. Irises have the most gorgeous, long, graceful leaves, and I definitely want to get a sense of where I'm going to place those. I am a big fan of working from a photo or from life when you can. And friends, feel free to just use my photo. It's a good one. Now, you didn't think I was going to only show you that once. Let's get on to the actual watercolor paper. I'm using Arches, not a scrap this time. And I am mapping out my iris. And I'm starting to even think a little bit about the direction, the way that those linear lines that are naturally occurring in the flower, how they're determining the shape of the flower. At this point, think back to that sketch that we did on the iPad, those big basic shapes, the big round that makes up that bottom beautiful ruffly petal, the side little flaps, the little ears on top, which are that creamy peachy yellow I just laid down, and this shape too, where the 2 ears meet on top, the purple, that light purple I just laid down. Really important. These are your basic shapes that make up this flower. And you know what, friends? I don't know about you, but I can already see the beauty of this flower in just a few strokes, and that's pretty exciting. You can at this point continue to build up, get a little bit darker with your color and your big brush. And remember, if you don't have a flat wash brush, no big deal. Just use a bigger brush so that you're laying down a lot of light color quickly. And yes, I'm coming in now to sketch in, map in, rough in, whatever you want to call it, those beautiful, graceful leaves. The pressure right now on your brush is really light. You're not pressing too hard at all, just enough to get a little bit of variation in line weight. So press down harder for thicker, and you get the drill. And honestly, friends, the water, it's very, very little pigment on your brush at this point and lots of water. Your brush shouldn't be to the point where it's almost dripping, but it should just be a little bit less than that, if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. Moving on to the color phase. And if for some reason that the first layer of your washes dried completely, I'll let you in on a little secret. You're gonna wanna go ahead and re-wet the entire surface. And so that could mean just taking your dagger brush and just adding some clean water in the main areas of the map that you previously had done. Because the thing is, you're going to want these areas to be a little damp, in my opinion, because you're gonna wanna take advantage of my wet on damp technique, which gives you a really nice soft diffusion of the color that you apply. So at this point, you're going to be digging into your purples, your bluish purples, your pinks, and you're going to use curved edge down on that dagger brush. And you're going to really be varying your pressure at this point. And you want to think about, as you lay your strokes down, they're going to be like cascading strokes stacked on top of one another with a little bit of a stagger. And that's what's going to naturally create that ruffled effect. So I don't want you to get hung up on, how do I paint the ruffles, Christy? They just seem so complicated, and the perfect ins and outs and the perfect perspective. I just want you to stack some strokes radiating out from each side of that main petal on the bottom. Let me break it down for you. Now, the one thing you want to notice here is the angle of my brush. Now, you could certainly turn your paper around and upside down so you didn't have to change the angle of your brush, or you could challenge yourself a little bit and just change the angle of your hand and how you're holding the brush. But as you can see, we're basically stacking a basic press, slight drag, and lift stroke on top of one another, staggered just a bit so you get that ruffly, imperfect edge on the left-hand side, and then repeating that again on the right. What I like to think about here is a variety of colors. So the purple in this bearded iris isn't just one purple. So if you want to paint Christy style, avoid the desire or the urge to mix up a couple of different puddles on your palette and be pulling from those. Back to the painting, I'm really avoiding the urge here to add too much linear detail. There's a little bit happening. Now, going right up into the center and starting to define that secondary, smaller circular area. Remember back to the sketch on the iPad. Using the side of my brush, usually curved side down, and adding a few curved, kind of C-like or backward C-like strokes. And then I'm quickly rinsing my brush and moving on to that yellow, beautiful center part. These are still petal-like areas, but they kind of notch in with these little ununiform V shapes in a darker orange. And that's giving you that kind of like, it's almost like this flower is wearing a corset. Right in the middle, everything looks cinched together. And I think that's a fantastic visual metaphor for when you're painting this particular flower. Make sure your iris has that corset pulled nice and tight at some point where everything's meeting up together. Okay, now back to the purple, rinsing my brush, and I'm creating those little flaps, those little wings, and those are like deep S curves starting from the center of the corset where it's cinched in and then floating out, and you're going to stack those S curves one on top of one another and let those colors run together. Make sure that you lift up slowly if you want to end at a little bit of a point. I wouldn't recommend ending each of your strokes for these flaps at a point because that's not going to give you as realistic of a look for the iris because it's more of a ruffle than a pointed petal. But a point here and there is no problem. Bounce around the composition as you paint. Don't feel like you have to fixate on one area and finish that area. That is a technique that a lot of hyper-realist photorealists use. They will literally work from like the center out and just work up the detail as they go. That is perfectly fine. You can certainly do that. But with the loose watercolor style, we tend to move around the page a little bit more. All right, friends, I'm going to get into the green a little bit here. And notice I am using the 1/4 inch dagger exclusively here, friends. And that's by design, just to keep things simple and to keep you from worrying about switching up brushes when and why. and just using a few different greens. The same thing goes here with the greens. Every time you go to the palette, choose something a little different, or get a little tip of something, some other color. If you have green mostly on your brush, dip into the yellow a little bit, dip into orange a little bit, dip into a darker green a little bit, and really mix things up. With the leaves, friends, it's all about changing the pressure of your brush and using the side of the brush, using the point of the brush, really mix it up. And as you're doing the press, drag, and lift, twist the brush in between your fingers and you're going to get really interesting textures. All right, now an iris bud, my friends, and this is just a downstroke or an upstroke with two different colors, and then it's basically like a really long amoeba-like teardrop shape that has a little bit of a point on both ends. And I'm making sure that the placement of this is nicely to the upper left of the main iris, and that I'm placing it so then when my stem can curve just slightly and meet up with the stem of the main iris. So I'm not going to put a ton of detail into this bud by design, because I want my main iris to be the focal point. A little bit more detail in the leaves here, friends. I'm adding some really dark watercolor, dark green, underneath to create a sense of light hitting the very top of the leaf, the top surface there on the bottom right-hand side. If you don't have a pre-mixed dark green, I want you to take what green you do have, mix in a little red, mix in a little blue. You might have to add some green back in. You can do that all by double dipping, triple dipping on your palette, or if you feel comfortable mixing separately on a palette, do that, but don't feel like you have to have a pre-mixed green to make this work. And friends, let me tell you what, this is basically where we're gonna stop and let things dry. There is not a ton of detail or layering that has to happen in order for you to have a convincing iris. I'm really excited about this technique because it's low stress. I hope you're having a good time. If you are, would you give this video a boop? Because we're about to head into the most exciting part of developing this iris, and you're gonna wanna stick around. Now, also head into comments, because if you've been here for a hot minute, you know that the comment section of my videos are off the charts crazy. You all have the best ideas, so let me know right now. What iris are you going to try? Are you going to try a bearded iris? Are you going to try a more traditional iris? There's the most gorgeous like peach bearded irises. Let me know if you're going to try this and what color iris you're going to go after first. Okay, friends, we are heading into the final step, in my opinion, the most blessed, exciting step of this all. Friends, this is the details phase. Now we're gonna go back to a scrap piece of paper. I'm going back to the very original map that I did, and I am going to practice these linear details. I'm going to practice loading my brush. Couple of tips when it comes to using a long liner brush like this, whichever one you might have. Number one, you're gonna need to reload fairly often, because especially if you're painting on a cold press, more textured paper, it's gonna soak up that pigment and water quickly. So reload often. Number two, you're going to want to be very aware of how much water to pigment ratio you have on your brush. If you're not getting that nice drag with a full brush of color that creates a line that remains colorful, you probably don't have enough water on your brush. If you're creating a beautiful line and it's gliding and flowing beautifully, but you don't see a lot of intensity and it's not high contrast against your background, you probably don't have enough pigment on your brush. Okay, tip number three, keep your hand loose. Now, I'm clearly using my fingers to control this brush quite a bit as I'm working through this practice, right? But also think about loosening up and using your whole arm more and less of your wrist and less of your fingers. You're gonna get, in that way, you're gonna get those more graceful lines more easily than if you're trying to create a really long, flowy, graceful line from one small point of rotation being your knuckles or your fingers versus a larger point of rotation, which would be your elbow or your shoulder. So Okay, the other thing I want you to do here is make really bubbly experimental lines like I just did in the upper ears of this iris. Those lines almost look like they could be cartoon clouds. And that's the point. In this practice section of the video, I want you to really push the envelope. Really voluptuous, loopy-doopy, crazy lines. Maybe you won't use as expressive of these kind of lines in your final painting, but the fact that you can push the envelope and create them is going to really give you a sense of confidence as you continue on to the next step. Okay, we are here. Friends, I just want to reiterate, avoid the urge. Just kind of back away from the painting, especially in those upper ears. You may feel like you don't have enough detail at all in those upper ears, but friends, it's okay. All right, let's just dive in because this is the fun part. So you're gonna be mixing up. Yes, I said mixing. Now you could just do the double, triple Christy dip, how I do things. I don't mix a lot on the palette. I'll link below to the video where I kind of explain how and why I don't mix on a palette. But you basically wanna take your existing blues, purples, pinky blues, whatever you ended up laying down on the paper, and you wanna add a little bit maybe of green to them, a little bit of orange to them, and that's going to dull down that color. It's going to give you a darker, duller, more intense, contrasty version of your original color. And then you can start laying on these linear details. I'm starting at the bottommost circle, that big basic circle we started with. I'm starting down there. And something to think about with the iris, that base petal. All of your lines are essentially going to radiate out from that yellow ruffly center part. I never know what the parts of the flower are called, but you know what I'm talking about. Okay, always radiating out for the most part. It's not a really strong point where all of the lines meet, but they're all pointing in that direction of the yellow ruffly center. Then I'm going up to that middle lighter purple, that stacked circle, if we're thinking back to our basic shapes, and I'm doing something really fun and a little abstract there where I'm doing more horizontal lines and lines that are just very repetitive, equidistant from one another in a slightly darker purple, not a ton of contrast. And then I'm just continuing on through the painting in the different areas, changing up my brush color based on the base layer color. Remember, a stronger or a little more muted version of the base layer color. And I'm following the brush contours of the original brush strokes I laid down. That's it, friends, and adding little lines here and there. Couple of things to keep in mind. You don't have to always have the same line weight. So your lines can be thick, thin, all in one stroke. You can have lines that are interrupted and they start and then they interrupt and they start up again. By really paying attention to the variety of the kinds of linear detail, the lines that you're adding, it's just going to give your painting that much more personality. I find this stage of the painting to be most relaxing because there isn't just one way to do this. There really isn't a step by step. I mean, we could go there, but friends, you've already laid down the gorgeous base brushstrokes, and really your linear detail is just following those shapes. And you get to decide and go with your own flow and find the joy in your own moment as you decide exactly where to add this linear detailing. And it's a beautiful thing. Friends, are you painting along with me? I really hope you are, because if you are, head on over to Instagram and tag me here and let me see what you're working on. Oh, please share with me. I can't wait to see how you've interpreted this really cool session. Okay, if you've had fun here today, give this video a boop because you know it helps my channel and I am so appreciative. But also, let's get into the comments one more time. I want to hear which part of this process, the map, the color, the details, which part is your favorite? I know which part's mine, it's the details. So let's get into the conversation. And you know what? If you've had an aha moment in this one, if you've learned something, your mind's blown a little bit, let us know that too. Okay, guess what? You're ready to attack a watercolor sunflower. Now go watch this and go get it. Happy painting, friends.